Hey everybody, how's it going? Let's get into some community interactions here, which is our third set of notes in this unit. So we are over here on the third level of ecology. We've done organism, we've done population, heading into community. So how are communities structured, and how do these interactions of these species and communities lead to emergent properties? So communities are, have a lot to do with interactions, right? Because it's multiple populations now. So we're going to be investigating a lot of how these interactions between things come about and kind of manifest themselves in the world. So you've probably seen some of these words before, maybe a lot of these words before. Competition, Amensalism, maybe not. Predation, Mutualism, Commensalism, I'm guessing yes. Neutralism. So with the old plus minus system here, plus minus 0, it shows you if it's a plus, they're getting a benefit. If it's a minus, not so much. If it's a 0, then really doesn't care, not affected. So we're going to go through a lot of these on kind of individual basis. Competition. So a contest basically between individuals for shared resources. So a minus interaction, competition. Even when you win the battle, you spend a lot of energy in competition. So there is intra-specific competition. If you look at the first red word over here on the left, and this is between individuals of the same species, which is what conspecific means. Conspecific just refers to animals of the same species. And so when you look at competition between organisms of the same species, you might look here on this leaf and see some caterpillars competing, right? Two things that are the same species, but they're competing for food or something like that. Could be for mates. Interspecific between individuals of different species. So now you have caterpillars competing with the aphids down here, which would be interspecific competition. You have this one term right here called interference competition, and he's not really like trying to eat the leaf or anything. He's just kind of in the way. He's just interfering with the caterpillar. So causing a problem, but not really competing. Niche, some people say niche. You have a couple different versions of this word right here. You have the fundamental niche, which is the maximum possible niche. So if I get my marker over here, so you're looking at a couple different organisms up here that live on these rocky shores of the ocean, intertidal zone, you might have heard it called. And so you have what's called a realized niche, right? Which is where these things can live pretty much anywhere. The fundamental niche, meaning they can go and live pretty much anywhere on the hill slope here. And then you have the realized one, which is the actual niche. So down here you see the fundamental, where you have these brown guys and they can live pretty much anywhere up and down, under the water, over the water, whatever. But now when these guys move in, even though the brown guys could live down here where the blue ones are, their realized niche, they're kind of being pushed out by these guys. And so they're living higher up on the hill now. So this is their realized niche, which is the realized niche is always a little bit smaller than the fundamental because competition is pushing them out. Okay. Competitive exclusion. What this means is species cannot coexist if they occupy the identical niche. If two things want the exact same resources in the exact same place, there's going to be competition, and there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers, basically. If they are competing for the exact same thing, one will eventually outcompete the other. Okay, so here's an example. We have some bacteria, I believe, on these pictures, and so they're all showing really good S-curves on all three of these. And if they're put in their own different environments, they all thrive really well, right? They all reach their carrying capacity and they're all doing well and hanging out. If you put two of them in the same one, look what happens. They both want the same resources. This one is still thriving. This one, not so much. They got outcompeted. Okay, and this guy is getting outcompeted up here by this one. So when you put them in the exact same area, it doesn't always work out. You don't necessarily see them both having perfect S-curves anymore. Resource partitioning. This is a way that organisms try to reduce the competition because they do want to be in the same niche and they do want to compete for the same resources or the same habitat. But they kind of reduce this competition by what's called resource partitioning, where you might have a 40 or 50-foot pine tree here, and they will just take different portions of the tree so that they don't have to fight over different habitats and waste a lot of time fighting over, I want this entire tree to myself. They actually share a little bit, and they partition the resources so that they can kind of all coexist. Character displacement. So when populations do compete, things can diverge, right? They can adapt. And so if you look at how allopatric and sympatric species might fit into this, remember this is back evolution terms, right? And we actually had, I think, the same thing we looked at back then. So if you look here and you have a species living in the area by itself, again, you have percent of individuals in each size class. So they have, this group here and this group here when they show them individually, but they're kind of all in the same area, right? They're all in the same zone where they're at. But if you put them in the same area, these two would be allopatric, right? Where they live in other country, meaning they're separate from each other. But if you put them sympatric, if you put them in the same area, look what happens. The yellow guys kind of go this way with their beak depth, and the other guys go this way. So some beaks get a little smaller, some beaks get a little bigger when you put them together, right? And that is, we've seen that in evolution before, and this is how some competing populations end up dealing with things. Amensalism. If you look at this one, you've probably heard of commensalism, where one thing benefits and the other one doesn't care. This is where one thing gets hurt and the other one doesn't know it's doing it. So in this case, the fungus Penicillium releases penicillin, which is toxic to the Staphylococcus bacteria, as you may know. We take penicillin to help with our staph infections and stuff like that. The fungus doesn't gain anything, though. The fungus produces this penicillin, which ends up being toxic to this other thing, but it's not really intending to kill it. It's just one of those things that happens, one of those interactions that turns out poor for one thing and the other one just doesn't care. So that's what amensalism is. Predation, you can probably figure out. And, the other slide kind of showed minus when you're talking about the energy. This one is showing it as plus because, eventually when you're talking about predation, I think I just said minus. That was competition. This is predation. Predation's definitely a plus minus. You're definitely going to have a winner, right? The predator is probably going to take down the prey and eat the other species. So definitely going to have a plus minus on this one. Sorry about my mix up there. I was thinking competition earlier. Effects of predation. So a lot of times, predation, what drives, remember we talked about predation selection back in the day, and this drives a lot of changes, right, on the prey side, and they're able to blend in a little more, and they get more camouflage, or what we call catalepsies. So lots of pictures of things blending in down here that you can tell. Aposematic coloration, another effect of predation. These are warning colors, advertising to predators that I'm a threat. I may not look big and tough, but you're not going to like it if you eat me because, there's things in my skin that are not going to taste good to you or will end up being poisonous to you. Mimicry also is a result of this, and there's actually two types of mimicry. You guys probably only realize the one type, but Batesian mimicry, where the harmless species mimics the harmful species. So you have things that are not snakes, like the hawk moth larva, that are trying to mimic what a snake looks like. So most things leave snakes alone. So if you can look like a snake, that probably means you're going to live a little bit longer. The other one is Malarian mimicry, and This is where it really is used. All of these colors are used to reinforce the message to the predators, right? So two harmful species adapt similar features to reinforce the distastefulness to predators. So think of all the things. You have yellow jackets, and you have bees, and you have wasps, and all the different versions of those that are almost all black and yellow. And it just reinforces to a lot of the birds and other things that might want to come and eat them that you may not want to do that. So it becomes like a strength in numbers thing. Herbivory, as you might suspect, is a plus-minus relationship, right? The herbivores are going to eat the plants. So that's just the way it goes. But plants do have an array of defenses against herbivores to help keep the process in check, because you don't want herbivory to just run wild, because then you would really be taking out a big chunk of the food chain, and it would probably get out of balance that way. So here's a couple examples of things plants can do to protect themselves, even though they're just kind of stuck in the ground and they can't run away. They have chemicals, they have alkaloids in them, like tobacco plants, which produce physiological effects, which, some people tend to enjoy tobacco, but hopefully not too much, given its cancer-causing qualities. But animals, they eat tobacco, and they're not really going to like the way it makes them feel, and so they'll pretty much avoid them. Tannins, chemicals in tea leaves that are really bitter, and so animals, again, aren't going to like that bitter taste. Terpenoids can be toxic. Obviously, lots of plants have poisonous qualities to them. Or then you just have the mechanical defense, like the thorns and the spines that keep things away from them. Okay. There was also one when I took students to Costa Rica. There was one that was pretty cool. I don't remember the name of it, but basically it would be out like this. And when an herbivore, a deer or something, comes up and starts nibbling on it, as soon as it feels that touch, it would kind of like pull back and become very small, and it would condense into what looked like a blade of grass. And then the deer would be like, oh, there's nothing to eat, and it would just move on to the next thing. And then a few minutes later, you would see this blade of grass then kind of like branch out and start collecting sun again for photosynthesis. It was pretty cool. Once it was touched by the herbivore, it just kind of retracted itself and said, nothing to see here, move along. So kind of cool. You can go through this table. I'm not going to sit here and read a table to you. I'm not even going to ask you to memorize this table. It's just kind of a list of some cool medicines that are found in plants. Symbiosis, symbiotic relationships, you guys are probably fairly familiar with. Parasitism, mutualism, commensalism. Parasitism being plus minus, mutualism plus plus, everybody wins. Commensalism plus zero, which is, one thing gets a benefit and the others just don't care. We'll see some examples of these as we go. Whoops. Parasitism. The mosquito and mammal is probably pretty self-explanatory. The brood parasitism, you can see in here, there's a different egg in there. And what happens is some birds, some parasitic birds will actually lay their egg in another bird's nest, and that bird ends up just kind of taking care of this other species and has to feed it and whatever, and basically the other ones can kind of move on, and this other bird is raising the parasitic bird's baby, spending a lot of energy having to feed it and do all this, and a lot of times the parasitic bird that comes out of that egg is bigger than a lot of these other birds that come out of the eggs, and they just kind of kick them out of the nest. So it becomes a big problem, actually. I'm not going to click on this video right now, but you totally should. This is like one of the best videos of the year. Hope you're not too squeamish. There's a little bit in here that might make you squirm a little bit, but it's pretty awesome. It's about some parasitic wasps. The slide down here, if we look at this is about kind of a life cycle of what goes on with a parasite. So you have adult flukes that produce eggs here in this number one scenario, this box right here that I'm looking at. And so they produce the eggs inside the cow. The eggs are passed in the cow's feces. So the eggs are sent out of the cow, right, dropped on the ground. The snails eat the fluke eggs, which later hatch inside the snail's intestine and asexually reproduce offspring. So the offspring are passed from the snail in slime balls, and then the ant eats the slime ball. And then something goes crazy in this guy's brain right here. If you look up here, some of the flukes migrate into the ant's brain and cause the ant to climb to the tip of the blade of the grass, where it is more likely to then be eaten by a cow, which then starts the whole cycle over again. Pretty wild life cycle for a parasite to keep getting passed through different organisms and ultimately end up back in the cow. So kind of crazy. But make sure you check out that Body Invaders video. It's pretty wild. Mutualism. You have ants and acacia trees. The ants protect the acacia tree from other herbivores because when you have a lot of ants all over things, many things will not go near it. And it clears the space at the bottom of the tree, give it some room to breathe and to get nutrients and to get water in there. I'm sure you know the Nemo story. The marlin and the sea anemone, right? You have the clownfish. I put marlin because he's a clownfish, but that was his name in the movie. Clownfish keep other fish away. They're kind of aggressive, and they keep other fish away from the anemone so it doesn't get eaten. And the anemone has some stinging tentacles to kind of protect the clownfish, so they can help each other. Commensalism, where things benefit, one thing benefits and the other doesn't. So an African buffalo and an egret, the egret just kind of hangs out on the back, so it has a good view of things. The buffalo doesn't really care. The nesting bird in a tree, birds build nests in trees all the time. Trees really don't care. Clearly, they couldn't do anything about it anyway. White-footed mouse in a burdock plant. You can see a little burr stuck to the mouse. It might look painful. It's really not. It's just stuck to him, and it'll come off at some point. But it's a way to spread seeds so that they can make more plants. So which factors regulate population size the most? There's two concept models. The bottom up, the amount of producers control the populations above them. Does it work that way? Or does it work the other way around, where the amount of predators controls the levels below them? Or could it be both, maybe? It probably is both. There are good examples of both. Obviously, you have to have producers at the bottom to, kind of kick off every food web and every food chain on the planet. You have to have producers to trap the energy. But if you don't have predators, if you take the predators out, you may know the Yellowstone story where when the wolves were taken out of Yellowstone, then the herbivores went crazy and the deer and the elk just destroyed the plant life. And that actually caused the rivers to get out of control. And it hurt the beaver population. And so there was all this cascade of problems because they took out the wolf, which was the main predator. And so they've reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone to try and get that balance back, and it's working pretty well. So could both models work simultaneously? Yes. We just went through that. This is just kind of a little table to show you that basically the more types of plant biomass you have, the more plant biomass you have, the more factors that are going to be affected. You're going to have herbivory, you're going to have competition, you're going to have predation throughout all of these levels of plants and herbivores and carnivores and secondary carnivores. So the more plant biomass you have, the more of these relationships you're going to see. The fewer plants, fewer biomass you're going to have, you're really not going to see very many relationships like that whatsoever, because you're probably not going to have a very thriving community. So the word community itself, many populations living at the same place at the same time. So, buffalo in Montana and buffalo in China are not in the same community. They could even be the exact same species, but you would not consider them the same community because they're dealing with different factors. They're not living in the same place. Okay. So this is how groups of species really interact and form functional communities. So you can see, the elephants and the lions down here, and this is basically like Lion King, right? With hyenas and egrets and snakes and all sorts of different animals are going to live in that African community. They're going to interact with each other. So hang on one second, guys. Okay, sorry about that little break, which you guys probably didn't even notice, but getting into diversity here, the number of different organisms that comprise the community. So um, basically, there's this diversity stability hypothesis, which says the more diverse a community, the more resistant that community is to disturbances. So, which should make a little bit of sense to you, and I'll show you some examples here in a minute. Couple terms though: species richness, the number of different species, so how many different things are there, and then relative abundance, the proportional number of a species compared to all the organisms present. I think those are probably kind of self-explanatory terms for you. If we look at kind of the diversity of these two communities here, you look at community one, which has 25% of A, B, C, and D type trees. You look at community two, which has 80% of A, and then 5, 5, and 10% of D. Your more diverse is clearly going to be community one, because if in community two, if the A trees were wiped out, you wouldn't have hardly anything at all, right? If they got a disease, that would cause a problem for that community. Where in the other one, with them all being kind of evenly spread out, you would have a much better chance for surviving that disturbance, right? So, disturbances are any event that alters community structure by removing organisms or changing resource availability. So, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, another one here, the diversity will be highest in communities that experience an intermediate level of disturbance. So, it's not that disturbance is bad, it's that when you get too much disturbance or too frequent, then it becomes a big problem for the community. Um, but a little bit of disturbance is a good thing to kind of stir up. You don't want them to become too stagnant, too stable. Um, so you can kind of think about a little thought question there about how do R selected and K selected species play into this hypothesis. So I'll let you think about that one. So um, this kind of shows you kind of a little bit about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, this graph right here. So if we look at this one, here's uh, frequent and infrequent disturbances, and here's diversity from low to high. So when you look in the middle, you actually get the most diversity here with an intermediate amount of disturbance. And here's an example down here, right? When a tree falls over and it knocks out like some of the little ones below it, but it creates this sunlight. Now it gives all these things that were down there a chance to compete and to get the sunlight and get the resources it needs to now thrive. And so now new things will all come up that were probably shaded out by that bigger tree, right? So a little bit of gap, a little bit of disturbance in the forest causes a lot of regrowth and new growth. So that's a good thing. A little bit more. So humans generally increase the disturbance, right? We disturb a lot of the planet. You can see a pre-trawling community in the Gulf of Mexico, meaning before they were like dragging nets down there for all the fish and everything, and you can see a little coral reef there. And then post-trawling community in the Gulf of Mexico, because it was done repeatedly. This is more than a intermediate disturbance. So now you see the reef is pretty much gone, and there's no life there in that area anymore, which is unfortunate. So, too little disturbance, you don't really get a lot of growth, you don't get a lot of changeover. Too much, you probably destroy habitats and things like that, and then you're going to have destruction as well. So, that intermediate disturbance is really kind of the sweet spot. Moving into succession, I think you guys have probably gone over succession a few times in previous classes. Primary succession is discussing, organisms that moved to previously uninhabited land, and then secondary was on previously inhabited land. So generally, the difference is just soil, right? So a lot of times in primary succession, the soil has to be created, where in secondary succession, the soil was already there, which means it's going to happen a lot faster when it comes back. So primary succession here, you can see Glacier Bay, Alaska here. You can see, massive glacier that was there, but now the glacier is retreating, right? And you can see the outline of where the glacier was, and you can look at the years where the glacier um, was like 1794, and then all the way back to these dates now, and how the glacier is now retreating, and that's uncovering a lot of rocky ground, which will then become places for things like lichens and what we call pioneer species to live, and they will start creating soil. So um, here's the second slide with Glacier Bay. The glacier has retreated, so it's no longer ice, and you can see this rocky ground here, and you have what's called pioneer species, which are the first things to live in an area. So things like lichens and moss and cyanobacteria, and they will break down that rock, and they will eventually form soil, which will then allow some of the smaller plants and flowers to start moving in, weeds generally first, and then you get some bigger plant life, and then ultimately you get a forest. But it's probably going to take some time, right? Primary succession is usually 100 to 300 years. And ultimately, when you get to the end of that and you have this fully thriving community, which sometimes is a forest, sometimes it's not necessarily a forest, but it's called a climax community, when you finally have a fully functioning community again. Secondary succession, example in Mount St. Helens. Hang on one second. Sorry about that, just had to sneeze real quick. Secondary succession, Mount St. Helens. So this is when the volcano erupted and took out a huge chunk of the forest, right? It's called pyroclastic blast, when all those hot gases are coming out of the volcano and they wipe out pretty much everything around it. And you can see what it looked like in 1980, where it was just devastated. And then in 1997, it's starting to come back. It's certainly not a fully functioning community yet, but it's definitely on its way, starting to get some trees back in there, and you see a lot more green growth in there. But the soil was there, so it's not going to take 300 years to build it back. It may take 50 or 100, but it's going to happen much faster than primary succession. All right, a few more terms heading in to the home stretch here for the end of these notes. A few more slides. Biogeographic factors, right? So sometimes where things are going to play a role in this. So we have the area hypothesis, where larger areas contain more species than smaller areas because they can support bigger populations. That's probably pretty much common sense, right? So is there evidence, though, that's contrary to this hypothesis? Do all biomes follow this model? So it says big areas contain more diversity. So is there anything you can think of that would be opposite to that? Can you think of a big area that doesn't have much diversity? Or can you think of a small area that has a ton of diversity? In general, this rule is probably pretty true, but there are exceptions, right? Both on the big side and the small side. On the small side, you might think of islands, right? A lot of islands are pretty small, but they're also pretty diverse. They have a lot of species richness, meaning a lot of different species there. And it's really related to just, two factors, right? So the rate of extinction, how many things are dying off the island, and then the rate of immigration. Things have to immigrate into the island to be there. So there's a balance of, things going extinct and things immigrating in. Often they're kept in balance, but the island size and something called the source pool are factors as well. The source pool is how close is the island to the mainland, really, right? The mainland is the source pool generally, because that's where a lot of the organisms are going to immigrate from. So this just shows you a relationship between the immigration of new species and the species extinction, and kind of shows, as one goes down, the other goes up type thing. So, probably kind of self-explanatory for you guys. Here's a little bit more about the islands. Move my head out of the way here. So island effect supports the area hypothesis for species richness. So if we look at these different things going on here, let me grab a pen. So here's a chain of islands right here, and it says species richness increases with island size. Okay, so here's bird species, here's bats. So it's birds on this one, it's bats on this one, it's reptile on this one, butterfly on this one. And for the most part, you can see, the area down here at the very bottom. You can see, the trend is a little bit upwards for all of these things. The bigger the island, the more area it has, the more of those things that there are. So that does kind of support that area hypothesis. And then here's the source pool. So the distance from the source pool obviously has an effect on the number of species on islands. So if we look at this graph right here, species richness decreases with increasing distance from the source pool. So the farther they get from the source pool, the fewer the species, right? Makes sense. It's going to be harder to get there from the mainland. So, if Australia is the source pool over here, then these islands are probably going to have, a lot more diversity than, say, Easter Island, which is way out here. Okay. So, the further you get from the mainland or from the source pool, the the species richness or the diversity will decrease. Okay. And that is all. I didn't go back, though. I didn't mention the opposite on the big side. Antarctica, places, North and South Pole, really big areas that wouldn't have a lot of diversity. So that also is kind of one of the exceptions to that rule. Huge area, but not very much diversity. Okay. So that is all for our ecological community notes. And hopefully that was helpful to you guys. I'll be talking to you soon. See ya.